I'm very excited to announce our next session where we're going to be discussing education technology and how to make things fairer. The talk is being hosted by Ravi Gurumurthy, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Nesta, and I also want to thank Nesta for helping convene this talk. Ravi, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello and welcome to this session on EdTech and how to make education fairer. My name is Ravi Gurumurthy and I'm the CEO of Nesta, the Innovation Foundation. For those of you who don't know us, our purpose is to design, test and scale solutions to society's biggest challenges. And one of the three missions that we've chosen to focus on over the next few years is to eliminate the gap in achievement between kids on free school meals and the average, a gap that's widened as a result of COVID and school closures over the last year. And it's that subject that we want to focus on now. I think over the last year, we've all reflected on how COVID is changing society. And a consistent trend we've seen is COVID not creating U-turns or radical departures, but acting as an accelerator or magnifier of existing trends, whether that's the use of technology or deep-seated inequalities. And with regard to technology in particular, I think there's often a lag between technological potential and the take-up of new products by users as habits and routines and preferences take time to shift. And that diffusion, those S-curves can often take decades. But COVID has been a great accelerant. It's been a forcing mechanism. In the past year, 184 countries have had to close their schools, affecting 1.5 billion users. And EdTech has actually played a really important role in helping students continue learning across the world. In the UK, some of our research suggests that, for instance, usage of maths products in England has gone up 7-fold just in March 2020 alone. But it's clear that we are really at the beginning of this journey. So far, what we've often seen is an automation and digitization of existing practices, rather than the opportunity to rethink how learning takes place, how it can be more personalized, adaptive, more social, and how it can enable teachers to focus on the things that only they can do. And so far, EdTech has not particularly helped narrow inequalities. In fact, it may have exacerbated them. While big strides have been made through the government's push on access to devices, Nesta's research suggests there is a persistent engagement gap between children on free school meals and the average when it comes to online learning. So today, we're talking about the potential to narrow those gaps, and we'll hear from the Elliot-Major in a second, who is Professor of Social Mobility at Exeter University. But I'm delighted to first introduce Rose Luckin, who is Professor of Learning Centre Design at UCL's Knowledge Lab, to kick us off. And please do put your questions on the platform as they're speaking. We'll have plenty of time to try and engage with them. Rose, over to you.
Thanks, Ravi. Yes, I think there's been a huge change during the pandemic. In November of 2018, I was one of the co-founders of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, and I remember at the launch saying, I'm so excited because the first time ever in the history of the world, we're now in a position through the combination of networks and artificial intelligence to really provide a good quality education to all young people. And with 63 million teachers short, that was a huge thing to be excited about. I hasten to add that I do not mean technology taking teachers' jobs away. I mean technology giving teachers superpowers. So it was time to be excited then. And I think now, yes, absolutely, I can be incredibly positive about the potential that EdTech, particularly artificial intelligence, brings for personalizing education so that it can meet the needs of every learner where they are. Personalized feedback to help you wherever you're struggling with something, and feedback for teachers as well to help them understand precisely where and when their students need assistance. Certainly in the research that we conducted during the pandemic, people were very positive about the potential of education, of educational technology to really improve education over time. We found that small tech companies were really going out of their way to try and adapt their product or service to meet the needs of social distancing or whatever the issues the teachers were. It was very interesting that when we spoke to EdTech companies at the start of lockdown in March last year, their major worry was paying the rent on their premises. By the time we asked them that same question in October, their major worry was, how do we deal with the huge increase in customers that we have and still manage to give them a good service? We found over 80% of teachers, over 70% of school leaders were trying EdTech they'd never tried before, and then recommending it to others. And given that most people in education buy the product that another colleague has recommended to them, that's a pretty strong recommendation. And finally, I think the really boost for EdTech was that, of course, we really needed to connect people. And that was the power of technology. So, for example, when parents felt well connected to their school, they felt they knew what was going on, they were 10 times more likely to feel confident that their school was going to be able to deliver quality education throughout the course of the pandemic. Now, of course, not everything is glossy and glowing. I'm giving you the positive spin, and I'm sure later on in the conversation we'll look at some of the negatives, and certainly it wasn't equally spread and there were huge problems. But I know Lee will be speaking to that, and he's much more of an expert on this, but I do recognise the huge inequality, and I find it deeply frustrating. Because when I stood up in the autumn of 2018 and said what a great force this could be for equality, for making sure everybody could get good quality education, I fear that things are moving in the other direction. So I do recognise that, but I still think we should be excited about the potential and the fact that during the pandemic we have made big strides. Teachers did amazingly. They learned how to leverage EdTech really quickly, often when they hadn't really used it before. So applaud to the teachers for sure. And I think lots of reasons to be positive. Yeah, definitely, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Rose. Let's go over to you, Lee, for your perspective.
So I just want to start, and it's great to be here face to face, by the way. And there's an irony in this, being an EdTech conference, but actually being here in person, which is great. I want to just sort of set the context a little bit with the extent of inequality in society and how that's been exacerbated over the last 15 months. But I do think there are opportunities in tech, and we'll get into that. But just so you're all aware of the extent of where we are, before the pandemic, Britain, had one of the lowest social mobility levels in the world. So that means basically where you're from largely determines where you get to in life, and that's the same in many countries. United States and United Kingdom being the worst in terms of your sort of opportunities in life, and the attainment gap between poorer children and the rest was actually, well, it was sort of not narrowing. It was getting worse before the pandemic. What the pandemic has done has exposed those inequalities, and it's exacerbated it. I hope I'm not going to depress you all too much on a Monday morning, but it has, and we've done lots of research on that, and we've got a briefing coming out in the next week or so, which shows, it looks at the 4 different nations, but we've shown that about 110 to 120 classroom days were missed during the year of the pandemic. It's going to extend even longer. We're calling it the year of the pandemic. It's probably going to be more than that, isn't it? So that's well over half of classroom days missed. Now, what we know, of course, is that there was lots of online learning that happened as well. But what we're also finding from the research is that there is a clear digital divide and a huge variation actually in the use of technology. And so I think in many ways the pandemic has jolted the education system into thinking about it more seriously. And I think it probably needed that jolt, probably not from a pandemic, but it needed that. My worry, Rosemary and Ravi, I would say, for us to discuss, my worry is that it's the more privileged children who are benefiting that, and that's partly because the schools they're in are delivering these technologies in a more effective way, but it's also about the digital divide at home, and you'll all have heard the debates about connectivity. About 1 million children do not have adequate connectivity in a digital sense. So I think there are real challenges here. I want to come on to some of the opportunities as well, maybe in the conversation, because I think they're there, and I think tech has, we were talking about this before, I think it really could revolutionize. I know we talk about this a lot, but it could revolutionize education in a way that would enable all children to progress, and that really is my hope. But perhaps we can come back to that.
Well, perhaps we can dig into that now, actually. What is our vision, if you cast your mind sort of 5, 10, 15 years ahead, of how learning could be revolutionised, in your words? Rose, you talked quite a little bit about personalisation, both learning that adapts in programmes that adapt, but also allowing teachers to adapt their own learning through feedback. Can you just paint us a picture of where you think we could end up, but also say a little bit about where we are on that journey? What's the state of the art now?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. It is a huge opportunity, you're rightly, and it could be a revolution, and it could be a really positive revolution. I think we mustn't leave this conversation without looking at the risks involved of negativity, but let's stay with the positive and the potential opportunities. So if I think about where we are now, sorry, reversing the order you asked the question, Ravi, but if I think about where we are now, there are there's a huge investment, particularly in China and the US, but growing in Europe and elsewhere, in artificially intelligent, adaptive technologies. And some of them are very good, some of them are less good. And these are technologies that can learn from the way a student is interacting with that technology about how well that student is learning a particular subject or a range of subjects over the curriculum. The system is then able to provide personalized feedback. And we know from studies done over many decades that good feedback is super important for learning. And so these systems, if they're well designed, are very effective. They're never as effective as a human teacher teaching a child one-to-one. But given how few people in the world will ever get that, I think they can be super helpful to children and to teachers. And as I was saying earlier, the information, of course, as the technology is tracking that student, it's also building up information to pass back to the teacher, to the parent. That as a teacher, and I was a teacher before I ever studied AI, and the number of times I would look at the 14-year-olds I was trying to teach and give, only I could understand what you're really struggling with, I could give you so much better help. And we've really got the possibility to do that now. Now, of course, the way that the technology tracks the student as they're learning is an issue that we need to think about carefully. It might be that the tracking is purely done on the activities that that student does with that software, i.e. logging the mouse clicks, the key taps, the activities that are done. But of course, we can collect data from facial expression, from voice, and it doesn't even have to be the content. It could be the pitch, the tone, the silences, the speed. We can collect data about heart rate. We can collect galvanic skin response. We can collect data about movement. That, of course, gives you a much, much richer picture and gives both the student and the teacher the chance to really start understanding things about themselves that just would never have been available previously, and that is a revolution. And if we start to think about how that could be connected with our increasing understanding from neuroscience about the way the brain learns, it's not that far away that those connections may be happening in real time. Where we are now is that we have huge amounts of investment and an increasing number of AI products making it into schools. It's hard to estimate the penetration in the UK, much easier to estimate the penetration in countries like China, but they're certainly growing. If you take a London-based company such as Century Tech, their impact is growing, they're growing globally, but they're also growing in the UK. But we're still really just scratching the surface of what's possible when it comes to EdTech. However, I would say that almost every school in the country is actually using AI, but probably in a way that they're unaware of. And that is through perhaps Google Classroom or any of the other big tech company products or an Amazon Alexa or whatever. So we need to recognize that there's a sort of officially labeled educational technology that we know is AI, and then there's lots of stuff that is AI and is technology but may not necessarily be seen as educational technology. But in terms of the opportunity, the pandemic has definitely increased the speed at which that penetration will happen, increased connectivity, increased devices, increased acceptance. And so that road to 5 years of what's possible is speeding up. But the way that pans out, and whether that turns out to be a positive experience that brings a fairer education system, is up to us and the decisions that we make now. It won't happen automatically, and we have to make some really explicit decisions if we're going to get that.
Thank you. Lee, over to you.
It's lovely hearing Rose talk about this, because I get very excited about all these possibilities. So I've become obsessive about effective feedback in the classroom, because when we did a review of all the education studies, we found that this, if done well, has the biggest impact on children. And it sort of makes sense. Any teacher would know this. If you've got a classroom of 30 pupils, what you really want to know is where every pupil is in their learning, to give them the appropriate feedback to move their learning on. Sounds very simple, but we've given teachers an impossible challenge, because you can't do that basically with a classroom of 30. There's all sorts of things you can do, and I work with teachers to do all these shortcuts and ways of doing it. What's really interesting, and by the way, some of the statistics, this is from an old study in New Zealand, but I love quoting them to teachers, trainee teachers, when I do sessions with them. 80% of time spent in class, children spend in class, is pretending to listen, right? So they're nodding. So it's lovely hearing you talk about after, because I think if you could determine whether they are just pretending to listen, that would be a real breakthrough for many teachers. 80% of feedback in the classroom is given by other pupils to pupils, and 80% of that is wrong. It's not great feedback. 40% of what teachers say in the classroom, the kids already know. So there's huge inefficiencies in the classroom, and I think what excites me about technology is, I know people call it sort of personalised or adaptive, and it was lovely hearing some sort of detail about that, because I think those are huge opportunities. The reason I get excited by it is because the pupils, and again, these are generalisations, they're averages, but the pupils I suspect nodding in class who aren't being engaged are those that tend to come from more challenging backgrounds. So, I hope that technology can provide the magic that would enable us to have a more efficient classrooms where children know where they're. It's really demoralising if you're a pupil and the class has gone ahead of where you are, and the gaps get too big and you're lost, basically. And that's why pupils, they're very good at it, by the way. They're very good in students are very good at this in lectures, I can tell you. So, nodding away, and attention has gone a long time ago. So I think that is really exciting for me. I mean, I'm less of an expert knowing where it is. All I would say is, I know a lot of schools are sort of starting on this journey. What I observed is there's this huge variation in how effectively it's being used at the moment, and I think any EdTech person, what I would say to you is, there's the great. I mean, we tend to think of these great teachers with all the time, and I would say, look, think about that teacher who is incredibly stressed, right? It's dealing with very challenging circumstances. How can we help those teachers with technology? But for me, this tech could help us get past that impossible challenge we set most teachers.
Thanks. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm quite excited by this is that if you look at the evidence, particularly in developing countries, about what works, it suggests that learning at the right level is absolutely critical. And there have been meta-analyses of normal computer-assisted learning, which is quite good, but it's basically learning at the right pace rather than genuinely adapting. And some of the programs that are genuinely adaptive, like MindSpark in India, suggest that the effect size is almost 50% higher if you have a genuinely adaptive program as opposed to just learning at the right pace. And I think the effect is particularly strong for those at the bottom of the lower learning levels, which stands to reason given that often you're trying to pitch a class at the average and you may therefore exclude those at the bottom. So I think there are some genuine reasons to say why personalised learning could help narrow achievement gaps. I think you've already talked a little bit about some of the barriers. Some of them are quite foundational and basic, like access to devices. But can you just say a little bit more, Lee, about what are your reasons for skepticism?
So I guess it's years and years observing the education system. there's a thing called, lots of people call it the Matthew effect. It's, for those who have, more is given. It's a longer quote than that, right? But essentially, every study of every aspect of education and life, again, I knew I was going to depress you all this morning, shows that those who already have things tend to get more. And so, I've got more radical over the years on this, because I think that the inequalities outside the school system have got more extreme. So if you want to do anything to level up, that phrase we hear a lot, the playing field, I think you've got to be incredibly targeted at those children that need it the most. And because, remember, 80% of variation outcomes comes from outside schools, and we put so much pressure on schools. And it's interesting, again, I wonder in future whether tech will enable us to sort of enable schools to take more of that variation in some ways and actually deal with some of these inequalities. But yes, I think you have to be, Ravi, you have to be incredibly targeted for those children. Otherwise, it tends to be those children that already have all the home environment support, parents, what have you, who will exploit the new technologies. And that is where, it's really interesting, because my own life, I'm not going to bore you with all mine, but it's interesting because I came from a background where my mum and dad didn't go to the university, and I'm the first person to go to university. Saying all what I've just said, it's interesting. My experiences were interesting. Some of the more working class families took on new tech. This was sort of, I don't know, Rosie, if you know more about this, but looking back on it, we were the first family to get a video thing before my sort of middle class friends. So I don't know, but maybe there is some conflicting evidence on this. But my general view on education is, you've got to be really targeted at those children that need it the most if you're going to make a difference.
I'd agree with that. I think it's really interesting when you look at the data, actually. So if you look at the OECD data on distribution of devices, which I know is only a small part of the story, the UK is way above average for OECD. But the distribution is poor, precisely what you've said, the Matthew effect. And then if you tie into that, again, OECD data that demonstrates that actually when it comes to disadvantage, that disadvantage in the community is exacerbated when the school doesn't have the technology to even provide the platform in the first place. So there is a real impact of the school in that situation. But I think what you're saying points to the fact that we need to take far more notice of the context in which learning is meant to be happening, and that we need to look at the ecosystem, which is something I feel really strongly about. We can't just look at schools. We can't just look at individual families. We can't just look at parent groups or local councils or whatever it is. We have to see it in a joined up way, because otherwise when something like this happens, and it will happen again, and it knocks out part of that ecosystem, in this issue the schools had to close in the main, other than for NHS children, parents' children, sorry. You knock out the ecosystem to a far greater extent than you actually need to. So I think we really need to think about the context, the ecosystem. But what we should have now, and if we haven't, and I fear we may not actually, have the data to point to precisely where the money needs to be focused, as you're saying, Lee. That's absolutely what we should do. And we should use the data to help us make the best choices about where that money needs to focus. But it's got to be careful. I asked the head teacher before I came in to ask some bits, what's it like for you and what's it like for your colleagues? And she spoke to a few colleagues, and I was really struck by a couple of the comments. Money wasted, schools reverting back to previous ways of teaching as they found that under-resourcing, poor broadband and infrastructure means that they can't continue. Things like not being able to get the batteries for things. So it's not just having the device, it's the peripherals that have gone up in price and are in short supply. Those kind of things all really hitting. So when we focus, we've got to really focus and look at the whole picture. To make sure that we do really try and meet the needs of those groups. And I couldn't agree with you more, Lee. I think we should be in a position to focus that spend very precisely now and try and help those people who really need it.
I think the thing I'd add to that is inevitably these debates get broader, because I always... I think motivation for learning is really important. So, you know, you could, and I'll be interested to know whether technology can help with that. I don't know, but it seems to me we have a system. My view is too narrow in the sense that we judge children in a very narrow sense. So,
yes.
you know, it's an academic sort of. I know it's two professors talking about this, but you know, but we've got a very narrow system in terms of how we value talent, and
Absolutely.
and so I don't know if how tech can help with that, but I worry a little bit that we've set up a system that essentially the middle classes can win, right? Because it's you're tested on on memorizing facts in summative exams. Even this year, you know, we're still doing that.
We're testing more this year.
Yeah.
We've cancelled exams and we're doing more exams.
Yeah.
Precisely, as you say. And actually that came up when I asked this head teacher for views from head teacher, was that a lot of what they would like to do, they can't do because they have to adhere to this very rigid assessment system and testing system. And why are we doing so much more testing and examining now? Because we've got to predict the grades and the teachers need to be able to defend themselves.
So there's an opening here, I
it's a
think,
real
in
problem.
You know, formative testing I really like,
Yeah,
right?
me too.
We should come back to our feedback.
Yeah.
So if you could do tests for children that it gives you information of where they are in their learning, which is for development, then that's fine. I think we get a bit obsessed with summative testing. So sorry to go off, Ravi, in a bit of a sort of educational sort of debate on that, but I do think it's important because those are big things, and I hope we could use technology to maybe help rebalance the system, because at the moment it's a very narrow system that's geared to those very summative tests at the end of the year.
Absolutely.
So how do we evolve to a different system? Because, you know, there's lots of innovation happening all around the world in lots of companies, lots of schools, but there's a slight risk, I think, that we don't necessarily evolve to the right equilibrium, because often it does involve different parts of the system innovating together and testing and trying things out. So I'm interested in both of your perspectives on what are the 2 or 3 things either government or EdTech innovators or organisations like Nesta could do to actually accelerate or make sure we capture the benefits of EdTech.
I can give you 3. I think 3 off the top of my head. I would say, firstly, for me, because I do believe that AI can be hugely powerful in helping in this debate, we need to make sure that everybody in education and training is what I would call AI ready. In other words, they understand enough about AI to be able to use it safely and leverage the potential, so that they don't leave themselves at risk because they don't understand it well enough. There are a lot of companies out there developing technology, many of newly set up companies funded by venture capital, equity investment. You know, they want to sell their products. And the fact that an educator doesn't really know enough about the AI won't stop them trying to sell those products. So I think it's really important that we get that piece ready. As you said in the introduction, Ravi, I'm a professor at University College London, but I'm also founder of something called Educate Ventures Research, and we've developed an AI readiness course that we're testing out at the moment. So hopefully that will be something we'll be able to make freely available to schools and colleges to try and help in this respect. So I think that is really important. Because if we don't do that, then we're leaving people basically to be seen as, you know, dollar bills, basically, for the picking up and collecting, which I don't think we want. I think, secondly, we have to somehow crack this assessment debate. And I would say that's because and that will be done as we do develop better and better formative assessment technologies, so that perhaps one day we will be able to convince policymakers that it can be done without these cripplingly ineffective summative exams and tests. Because assessment's important, but it doesn't have to be an exam. And what really frustrates me is that it seems to me that at the moment it's more important that you know what a fronted adverbial phrase is and how to use it than you know what AI is and how to use it without giving your data away and your privacy away. And I think that's criminal. And thirdly, and probably the biggest problem that we face, is big tech. You know, and I say it, and I know we're using Chrome for this event everywhere I look. And even last week, even the Times ran an article saying we've got to be careful. When did we ever decide we were going to give away all this power to big tech? You know, Google Classrooms, Google Chromes. There's now 40 different designs of Chromebooks for education. Google owns 10 of the top 12 K-12 education apps. You know, this is something we should be super worried about. Look at all the million-dollar fines, billions of dollars in fines from Australia to UK to US that company Google has suffered, and it makes no difference. They still go on doing it. And it's not just Google, of course. Google, Microsoft, Apple, all investing billions of dollars in educational technology. But children's data is not safe. It's absolutely not. And they're not transparent about what they do with it. And that's dangerous. And I really don't know how we've got ourselves into this position and why we're not more bothered about it. You know, I had Radio 4 on this morning. What do I hear? We must not stop opening up lockdown on the 21st of June because it's damaging our freedom. This is damaging our freedom. It's damaging our children's freedom. And nobody seems to care. You know, free is not freedom. Free in the technology world is actually completely the opposite of freedom. That's the biggest problem facing us. And if we don't wake up, and I don't know what it will take to wake people up about that, then we are in for a very unequal and rough ride, because it will be the wealthier, better educated people who will be able to protect themselves more. So that really worries me.
So 3 quick things. I don't know how much time we've got.
Sorry, I probably spoke
No,
too long
it's
there,
fine.
Lee. I apologise.
Fascinating. But 3 quick things I'd add to that, and I agree with all those. I think one, Ravi, you know, I've been involved with a lot of the sort of championing evidence in education and been involved in creating randomised trials and all that stuff. I mean, I think there are real opportunities in the tech sector to work with schools to do what I would call piloting more than. So I think we rush to do these randomised trials because of, you know, all sorts of reasons. I think Nesta's really well placed to do a bit more of what I'd call innovative pilots, where you're trying to deliver something, but you're doing it in a more formative way before you maybe go to a bigger trial with lots of schools. So there's a real space there that I don't think is done enough. So yeah, pilots, I'd say. The other thing, I agree on the curriculum. You know, I think the curriculum is a very rigid, traditional curriculum at the moment, and I think we need more tech in there. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I'm not an expert on tech, but I'm convinced of that. And I would say to the tech industry, you know, a lot of my work is about how do we enable people from all backgrounds to have decent lives, not even be rich, by the way, just to have literally a decent life. And a lot of the debate tends to be around traditional industries, you know, a lot of which probably are going to be outmoded in 20 years. I'd love to have more of a debate about how we use tech more generally to enable people from more disadvantaged backgrounds to get jobs, to whatever. And the debate tends to be quite traditional at the moment. The social mobility debate, we tend to, how do you get people to become lawyers in London, for example? You know, how do you get them into top universities? That sort of. So I think there's that. The last thing I'd say, the home. You know, so all my studies really show how profoundly important the home environment is in shaping outcomes, and a lot of the parents I speak to, I think, see technology as a threat because of all the stuff you read in the newspapers and all that. Less the big tech giants, to be honest. I think they sort of don't understand that threat in a way, but I think these are other threats about pornography or whatever it is. And I think there's a piece to be done with parents to enable them to see, here's the opportunities, so you can talk with your children rather than trying to police them. And I think, you know, I'm a parent still. If you talk to lots of parents, I think and I can count myself in this, I think we're all feeling a bit sort of overwhelmed by the pace of technological change. So I think we need to sort of do something about it, because that profoundly shapes how much the children will engage with schools, irrespective of how brilliant that technology is.
So true.
I think it's interesting what you say there, Lee, because if you look at the analysis about what shapes life chances, you might say, one, the earliest years are most formative, and you might say the sort of home learning environment and parenting is particularly decisive. Therefore, there's a slight risk that you focus on secondary and a factor that's perhaps less important than the most determinative. So what's your thought on what's the possible use of technology in supporting home learning or parenting? Is that an area that either of you wanted to comment on?
I'm not an expert on it. I just feel from a social mobility perspective, that's where you would go. And I just, Rosemary, you might know more, but I think you'd probably focus on the early years. I just don't know, Ravi, to be honest with you. But from a sort of, if you were going to analyse social mobility, you would probably go there actually, and home learning as well.
There's a huge increase in the investment in technology for use in the home, educational technology for use in the home, which would speak to that. I just worry about whether the homes that need it the most would be able to afford it. Again, your targeting might help to address that.
Yeah.
So technology is not allowing me to actually see questions, unfortunately. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking a couple more. One is about the sort of market structure, because I think what's interesting, one of the complaints I've heard from one or two EdTech entrepreneurs has been that government has stepped in and sometimes crowded out small actors and gone for sort of big multinational providers or provided things free. And some of the smaller organisations have struggled. It's a very difficult job for government to do, and it's quite easy to have some unintended consequences as it guides the evolution of this market. Have you got any advice for how to navigate that, Rose?
The market's definitely shifting. By the way, I think there are questions from the audience,
Okay.
but I think there's a slight hiccup in the.
We're trying to communicate to Ravi that we need to wrap up.
Okay.
I can't get through to him at the moment.
Can you hear that, Ravi?
Yes, I can.
Would you mind if I just stand up and give some thanks?
Did you catch that, Ravi?
Yeah, I did.
You're getting some online feedback here, Ravi.
Highly personalised.
Let me come up and join in. I'll just see. I hope you can hear me, Ravi. I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been a fascinating talk, and actually so in depth we don't have time for questions.
I'm sorry about
But
that.
It has covered a huge amount of ground and territory. If you are here live in the audience, do feel free to catch Lee or Rosemary to further that. Ravi, thank you also for your expertise. Thank you also for your expertise and your input into this conversation. It's been great moderation, and I hope we can continue this conversation online. That's it for now from this stage. We'll be back in around 10 minutes' time with what's going to be a fascinating conversation on biodiversity and the economics of it. So I'd like to thank you, all three of you, and sorry to not be able to do so in person, Ravi. Thank you very much.